Welcome, everyone, to Science from the Fringe. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford University. I am delighted today to have with me Jonas Herby, who's an economist in Copenhagen. Jonas, during the pandemic, wrote one of the most important pieces of scholarship that had come out of the pandemic, with the very basic question that you'd think everyone would want to answer, which is, did the lockdowns actually work to protect people? Specifically the early lockdowns in 2020, how effective were they in protecting people from COVID? And did they do what they were supposed to do, which is to slow the spread of the disease? Welcome, Jonas. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Jonas, I thought we'd start with just a little bit about your background. So you're an economist. Have your focus previously been on health and epidemiology, or did you turn your attention to COVID, just like so many other scientists from all across the world did, given the scale of the scope of the harms from the pandemic?
It's more the latter, I would say. I work with regulation, so I'm interested in all kind of regulation, how it affects societies, and if it works as we hope it should work. And then when the pandemic hit, I was working in a Danish think tank, and I remember we had a lunch meeting, an online lunch meeting actually, where we talked about who should we devote resources to look into this, or should we just keep on the normal track? And I volunteered to say that I could take a look at it and just keep up to date on what was going on. So it was a fast decision, made a kind of random decision, and it took me on a path that I haven't dreamed on. So that's how I got involved in.
It's
COVID.
It's dangerous. It's dangerous reading. I think that's the bottom line seems to be, is like you might get you down a track where you end up writing one of the most important papers of the pandemic.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want you to describe the paper. In fact, it's a meta-analysis, a very careful analysis of a whole bunch of other papers. But I want to just introduce this with just a little bit of background. I remember reading some of the very early papers asking whether the lockdown measures and the stay-at-home orders and all that, what effect did they actually have on disease spread? And I remember being quite frustrated by those early papers. Many of them were based on very simplistic models of disease spread. I mean, in any paper that addresses this, and in fact, I wrote a couple of papers like this and published them during the pandemic. In any paper, you have to ask a counterfactual question. You have to ask, what would have happened if the lockdowns had not happened? I mean, I assume that's exactly what you must have been studying when you were studying regulation. Like, what would have happened without the regulation? Like, how do economists normally answer questions like that? Like, what are the standards for answering questions like that? And what can go wrong when you address a question like that?
I mean, when many people think about how you figure out if something works, they think of these randomized control trials. So if you introduce a new drug to treat, for instance, the flu, then most people know that you don't just find 100 children sick with flu and then give them this drug and see if they get healthy. You need a control group, right? So if you give these 100 children the flu, they will probably get healthy. But no, you give them the drug, they'll probably get healthy, but you won't assume that it's because of the drug. Because you know there's other things going on too, especially the immune system. The immune system is fighting the flu just like the drug is supposed to do. So what you do is you have a control group. So you have 200 children, and the 100 of them you give the drug, and the rest just get a placebo, and then you see if there's an effect. And the problem with in economics and many social sciences is that there are many questions where it's impossible to do a randomized control trial. So you can't just have can't just take 10,000 Danes and say, now we cut your taxes in half and see what happens. Because basically, I mean, you could do it, but many people would feel it was unfair, and it's politically hard to do. Or you can't say that now we're going to tear down this hospital to see if it worked. if it worked or if something
so
else will appear.
randomize a lockdown.
Yeah, so this is a very common problems for social sciences. I mean, we meet these kind of problems all the time where we don't have the possibility to run a randomized control trial. So instead, we apply special techniques, special econometrics, so to kind of create a control group, so we can get this what's called like the treatment effects, and not mix it with everything else that is going on.
So I want to explore that just a bit for listeners who aren't steeped in the causal inference literature, as we say. Why do you have to randomize? What is special about randomization if you want to understand if a drug is good or bad for some outcome? Like why can't you just look at the data of the people that got the drug and then the people who didn't get the drug, compare them and say, oh well, the people who got the drug were healthier in some specific dimension than the people that didn't get the drug?
Oh yeah. So you randomize to make sure that you get rid of all. I think that you call them confounders. So basically, you're gonna say that if you have these 200 children and you say we're gonna give the drug to the first 100 children that come in with flu symptoms, then maybe you give them to the most concerned parents that are also most who treat the children the best and keep them home from school and so on. So the other reasons they get over the flu earlier than other children. So you can get these biases in your results if you don't randomize them. So, but if you randomize them, then you take two similar children, and then one of them get the drug and the other one doesn't get the drug. And then if you have many children, you know that the only difference between these two groups is the drug. And then the point is that you know that any difference in the path of the disease is due to the drug. So that's basically why
that sounds like science. I mean, that sounds like science, right? You have
I think that's what you do
versus the treatment group. I mean, that's exactly what you do. What like scientists would do. Some of those early papers I read, though, Jonas, what they of course, people didn't randomize lockdowns. It was more like the case you just described, where people, maybe the places that were most impacted early, they locked down early. Other places locked down later. There was other political factors involved. So it's not just that you can just compare places that locked down and didn't lock down. But the early papers that I was reading didn't even do that, Jonas. They didn't even try to compare places that locked down versus didn't lock down. That would make some sense. The early papers, what they did is they had a very simplistic model of what they thought the case spread would look like if, and they run the model. A good example of this is the Imperial College London model that was written, I think, in March of 2020. And in the model, you have, it's like a computer game. Like you have people interacting with other people, some of whom are infected and others who are not infected. There's some possibility of when there's a random interaction with an infected person and uninfected person, the disease passing on, and it's just a simulation model. And many of those early papers would run those like computer games of disease spread and use the output of that as a counterfactual, as a control group. They'd say, well, our computer model, which with all these like simulated individuals running into each other, if in that model, if you don't have a lockdown, the disease will spread, very, very quickly, and X number of people will die. Right. So, for instance, in the Imperial College model, I think projected that in the first couple of months of the pandemic, if there was no lockdown in the U.S., 2 million people would die.
Yeah, I think the Imperial College model was pure modeling. There was no. There was some of the papers had like they used data to make the trajectory. So they had to say, okay, it's going like it has a path now, and then we just assume this path will follow a bell curve as most diseases do. But I think the Imperial College model was just pure modeling. So there was no.
Yeah, it was there
was no actual model, data. Right? There was some data, of course, but it was not.
I mean, the model has various parameters that they
exactly.
use data, and then when they don't have the data for the parameters, they just sort of make it up in their heads or something. I mean, but then once you have the parameters, you can run the model and you'll get a projection of the path of the disease. The point I want to make is that it's really inappropriate to use that as the counterfactual if you want to assess, did the lockdowns work?
Yes, I agree. I think I've read many of these papers that say that, okay, we show that lockdowns work, but that's not what they show at all. They just model something, and models, they're great if you are in the beginning of a flu season or even the COVID pandemic to kind of get an understanding of what can happen. I mean, how can it evolve? Because that's small as the only thing you have, but you can't use it to show that something works. You have to use actual data to see. Okay, so some places locked down, some places had a really strict lockdown, and other places had a more lenient lockdown, and then compare real data to get an idea of whether the models and the parameters that we assumed in the beginning of the pandemic, if they were realistic.
I think is a very important point. But I'd say, like, in this study that you conducted, the one that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you're reading all of the papers, or most of the papers that were published on this topic of did the lockdowns work?
Yes.
Right. And most of those papers actually used the modeling as a counterfactual, or
Yes.
had other problems like this, right? So they were essentially pretending to know what would have happened because the model told them, rather than any real world situation where they didn't lock down, or they had a they could actually compare places that had a policy versus places that didn't have a policy or whatnot.
There was a very influential study in the summer of 2020 by a group from Imperial College London. It's called Flaxman et al. 2020. Yeah, that's estimated that lockdowns in Europe saved 3.2 million lives, I think it was. And this is exactly what they did. They just said that, okay, if we hadn't locked down, everything would just go on following this path. But now we locked down, and then we saved all these lives. And that just made the headlines in more or less all around the world. That the only problem is that they actually, in the paper, they write that we can't really say if it's the lockdown or if it's voluntary behavior changes, like people taking care of themselves and not meeting with other people because they're afraid of being sick. But it's in the paper. But when they communicated with the newspapers and media, they didn't mention that. They just said that lockdown is a great thing. We saved all these lives. So that study is not in the studies we go through, because it doesn't have a real control group. It doesn't use a real control group. It just pretends that everybody's going to behave as usual, even though there's a pandemic. And I think most people agree that nobody behaves as usual. Even if things were legal, we stopped doing them because we didn't want to spread the disease.
I want to explore that for just a minute before we move on to the actual paper, because I think that's a very, very important point. Let's just focus on the models that were used, and like take the Flaxman et al. Paper, or the Imperial College papers, the early Imperial College papers that Neil Ferguson and others did. Those models have random interactions between individuals, but they don't have the fact that people are in a pandemic. They're going to alter their behavior. They may decide not to meet with grandma as much if they think they're sick, right? For instance, you can't just use the normal interactions that people have outside of a pandemic to model. And in fact, when the threat of the infection spreading, or the threat of the gets more, then people will react in their own lives without any lockdown to not take risky actions if they possibly can. And of course, different groups in society may have different capacity to do that, right? Some people, especially poorer people living in situations where they have to work to feed their family, they may they'll still alter the behavior, but alter it less than somebody in the laptop class that can afford to stay at home, not lose their jobs if they're scared.
Exactly.
Did those models have that kind of feedback effect in there? This sort of alteration in people's voluntary alterations, people's behavior. I know they're still not appropriate to, even if they did, to use for a counterfactual in assessing the causal effect of the lockdowns. But just curious, like in your reading of the papers, did a lot of those models have that feedback effect?
I know that some models said that depending on your age, you had you responded differently on the pandemic. But to be honest, I didn't spend that much time reading those studies, because what we did, we can come back to that. This maybe is that we used a funnel approach, I think you can call it. So we took all the studies first, and then we screened them and said, okay, they're using a model. They don't use real data, so we don't spend that much time on this. I think.
I mean, I think that's such a telling thing. Essentially, if you want to answer a question, did the lockdowns work? Those modeling studies are useless. That's why you can funnel.
Exactly. Yeah, they're useless. Right. There another group of studies where I think actually the Flaxman study belongs is the interrupted time series studies. So those studies. So let me use another case here. If let's say you have a school system. And schools, they have been performing the same for 10 years, and now you say that let's do something in this system, and then what else? You hire more teachers, for instance, and then you watch the coming years, and you see that okay, now the students are performing better. Then even if you don't have a control group, it's reasonable to say that okay, I think these teachers, especially if nothing else markedly haven't, then it's fair to say that okay, I think these teachers actually did a difference, because we had a long time period where it was just average, and then we hired the extra teachers, and now it's better. So the difference is probably because of the teachers. We don't know 100% for sure, but it's pretty sure that's because of the teachers. But many studies during the pandemic used the same approach. So they say that okay, we have this trajectory for the pandemic. Now we apply the lockdown, and then we use the difference between the trajectory, the what's called what's called.
Okay, so for instance, you have the disease going along, and then all of a sudden it spikes up. The lockdown comes in place, and then the disease goes down. Right?
Exactly. Can
you attribute the reduction to the lockdown just by the fact that it was implemented? Like for instance, it could be implemented near the peak, and it would have gone down anyways, right? Because is that a legitimate approach?
Yeah, and the point here is that we know at least one other thing was going on, and that was the voluntary behavior changes. So contrary to the school example where we assumed that nothing else was going on, we know that people, they canceled flights, they canceled restaurant visits, they canceled birthday parties, they canceled all kind of parties, weddings, and so on. Even before the lockdowns were implemented. Recently, I was reading newspapers before the Danish lockdown, and there was papers with restaurants that are in economic problems because there were no guests in the restaurants, and the airport was just completely empty. And that was before the lockdown. So it was perfectly legal to travel and to go to the restaurant, but people didn't do it.
The Swedish response relied on this, right? The Swedish response said that if you can work from home, then work from home. Like there's no forced business closures, but if it's possible, then do so. Like that was an official recommendation of the Swedish health authorities.
Mm-hmm. And when there was a Danish group that studied this consumer spending in Denmark and Sweden. And they showed that consumer spending dropped almost as much in Sweden, and actually even more among the elderly in Sweden than in Denmark.
Right, because
unfortunately that was taken up as.
I mean, it's interesting because. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jonas.
Yeah, that study was interpreted as lockdown didn't have a large cost to society, but the real interpretation is that people are able of taking care of themselves, especially the elderly, because they know that this is mostly dangerous for old people. So it's clear they cut their spending more if they're asked to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that voluntary response to the pandemic threat is it's such an important point. I want to put a point on that. But it's not true. Like I looked at some Google mobility data, for instance, and there's a big disjunction between what happens in low-income neighborhoods versus high-income neighborhoods. Right? Low-income neighborhoods, what you see is the formal lockdowns are put in place, and you see a big reduction in mobility. So these are like data where people's cell phones are tracked, like they hold them in their pocket, and they can track where they go. And so you can see how much they're moving around. And the lockdowns had a big impact on people moving around in the cell phone data. But this happens for both low income and high income neighborhoods. But then within a short period of time, you see the mobility data start to the people start moving around a lot more in the low income neighborhoods. Whereas in the high income neighborhoods, you see a reduction in 2020 in mobility that lasts a very, very long time. So what the lesson I get from this is that there was a very different capacity to lock down for an extended period of time for people living in poorer neighborhoods versus in richer neighborhoods.
Yeah, there's differences in how many resources you have, but there's also differences in culture and other things. Because locking down is costly because we humans, we like to interact with social animals, right? So it's costly to lock down. But I think it's easier, for instance, in Denmark, where we have nuclear families and the grandparents live in their own homes. So in Denmark, it's fairly easy to just cut the ties and say, okay, we won't see you for half a year. But in more maybe more Catholic countries or more family bound countries where they have multi what's it called, where the grandparents live with the grandchildren, it's much more difficult to do it. Even if you have the resources, it's just more difficult because your whole society is based on the children taking care of the grandparents and so on. So resources matters, but also just the culture in the countries matters. And there are plenty of studies that show this, that the ability to handle the pandemic varies depending on a lot of factors, not just how many hospitals you have and so on, but also culture and income and how many square meters you have per person, in square meter housing you have per person and so on. So
there was a study in July of 2020. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine, did in Mumbai. A man named Anup Malani conducted in Mumbai in India, and he compared the seroprevalence, the measure of essentially what fraction of the population have antibodies that are specific to COVID, indicating that they've had an infection already, in the Mumbai slums, like the slum areas of Mumbai, versus the richer areas of Mumbai. And in the slum areas, he found a 70% seroprevalence in July of 2020. In the richer areas, 20%, 20%. I think a common theme, no matter where you look, that there was this big difference in the capacity to comply with the lockdown orders. Like if you are able to lock yourself away and never interact with any other human being, you're less likely to get COVID, right? That's the intuitive appeal of a lockdown.
And I think there's also
most people aren't able to do that.
There's probably also a difference in how you perceive the cost of lockdown. Because to be honest, for me, it was a nice time. I didn't have to go to work, and my wife, she's at home, so she took care of the kids during the time where the kindergartens were locked. So we had a really great time, and the family was just, it worked perfectly for us. But I think this is not the case for everybody. It's much easier for us working, did you call it the laptop class? Because we can just work from home. It's very easy, but other people have to go to work, and what to do with the kids if the schools are closed and so on. We didn't have any school kids, so we weren't that affected. They closed kindergartens for a short period in Denmark.
They apologized for that, actually. If I saw it correctly, they were okay. So I want to go back to the paper. So you've described one method, this interrupted time series, essentially using what happened before as a control for what goes after. But the problem is, depending on where you interrupt the time series, like the lockdown happens at the peak, well, you're attributing the reduction in the cases to the lockdown when it's not necessarily the case it was due to the lockdown. There may be other factors. So you excluded papers that had just pure interrupted time series from the analysis.
Yeah, so we excluded models and we excluded these interrupted time series, and then we focused entirely on what we call difference in difference studies, and how do we explain that easily? So if you say that you have this country with path for the pandemic and they choose to lock down. And then ideally you want to compare that to another country that had more or less the same path and didn't choose to lock down. And then you measure the effect, the difference in mortality in those two countries after the lockdowns. And if there's no difference, then the lockdown didn't work. And if there's a big difference, then the lockdowns seem to work. It's in reality, it's much more complicated because basically all countries locked down. I think there's only one country in this Oxford, what is it called? The stringency index. There's only one country that didn't lock down at all, that didn't implement any measures. Most countries did something. And when I say lockdown, I usually talk about, what I mean is you can have a strict lockdown or a lenient lockdown. So Sweden had a very lenient lockdown because they only closed, they didn't close that many things.
Like they had mass gathering restrictions, but other than that, I don't think they had a ton of like formal lockdown.
They also closed their universities, and then they had some bans on gatherings larger than 50, I think. But
they didn't close any schools, or they didn't formally close schools for kids under 16. No restrictions on you could have retail businesses open if you wanted to.
Yes.
Again, it was all very voluntary in some sense. Whereas like
there was a reason it was well known for not locking down.
Denmark,
so basically, but then using these econometric methods I talked about earlier, you can use all these small variations to kind of create these two countries that behave differently. So you can take, okay, this country didn't close schools, this country did. So how does that affect mortality rates in the longer run? And then you use all these small variances and different.
Okay, so just to give some intuition to listeners about what's going on. Let's just compare Sweden and Denmark and just do a very, very stylized thing. Okay, so Sweden did not force its schools to close ever for kids 16 and under, but Denmark closed schools for a short time in spring of 2020. You may object to this, Jonas, but like from an American, ignorant American like me, Denmark and Sweden are comparable to each other. Just Scandinavian countries. There's some similar cultures. I mean, it's not like such a big difference. It just happens that you're on one side of the border and their Swedes are on the other side of the border, right? And so you can look what's happening up until the moment the schools close in Denmark versus Sweden, what they did before the schools are closed in Denmark, whatever differences there are in the COVID deaths cannot be due to the schools closing or any other difference in policy because they're very, very similar to each other. And so you look at the before period to say, here's the sort of like baseline difference between Sweden and Denmark, and we're going to use that to say what would we expect if Denmark had continued to keep its policy of not closing schools. But then Denmark closes schools, and in the after period, after Denmark closes schools, there's a new difference between Sweden and Denmark. The baseline period is very, very is in the past, of course, but from that you have some expectation about what would have happened if there had not been a school closure. You generate the counterfactual from the before period, and then you apply it to the after period. And you look at what actually happened, the difference in Denmark and Sweden, and you attribute the difference in closing schools as the reason why Denmark and Sweden are different in the after period versus what they were in the before period.
I think that's a very good explanation, but obviously it's much easier if you have a graph to show what is actually going on. But
well, we might show. And
then the point here is that you use many countries, so you try to just like when you do this randomized control, you don't take two people, you take a lot of people, so any unknown confounders will kind of cancel out. So that's basically the point here.
I mean, I've read like once upon a time. I actually have a PhD in economics, Jonas. So I for my sins, I've read many of these papers. And so like it has there are these like more complicated methods where you combine multiple countries in their baseline periods to get something called synthetic controls. There are like mechanisms essentially to try to refine the expectations, but all of them have at their core the expectations of what would happen if you hadn't had differences in policy, the before period. but all of them have at their core a real world country as a control for the before period, a real world country for where you're comparing different real world countries with different policies in the after period, and it's the difference between the before and the after periods that allow you to isolate what the effect of the policy was.
Yes, exactly. And just to make it clear that this is not a bulletproof method, because it also has difficulties. Because how can you know that it's how do you know if it's causal or just correlation? It's not always clear, but there's different ways you can try to test that in your study. And in our paper, we also discussed this thoroughly, and we actually point to one thing. I think we were also talking a little about this earlier. We believe that the introduction of lockdowns were actually more or less random, because there are several studies that show that lockdowns were not implemented based on the trajectory of the pandemic in your own countries. It was implemented based on what other countries did and based on the information available at the time. So the reason we locked down in Denmark in the middle of March was not because we had a knowledge of what was going on in Denmark. It was because we could see that the Southern European countries were locking down, and we also had proof that now the pandemic is here in Denmark, so we have to do something. But it was not because we knew anything about. I mean, the information at the time was just very vague. So by coincidence, Denmark locked down at a different time in the pandemic trajectory than other countries did, and that has a huge. That is very important to understand why Denmark behaved. Why Denmark came out very well during the pandemic compared to countries like Sweden and Belgium, at least the first part of the pandemic.
Yeah, the first part. I mean, Jonas, I have to say, looking at the data over long run, Sweden did quite well actually on all mortality. Yeah.
But to be honest, I think no matter what crisis hits the world, the globe, I think the Scandinavian countries are going to.
They always do well. Okay, we're not going to get a spitting match over Scandinavia. The last thing I want is to get between the Swedes and the Danes in which country is better, because I love them both. So let me. But I want to return to this idea of this sort of difference in difference. You have then like a whole host of like of papers using different countries, using that some of which, a very few of which, actually deploy this sort of idea of trying to isolate the causal effect. Most of them are modeling papers or these interrupted time series papers, and the one of the threats then is that even the difference paper is that the countries choose when to lock down based on the spread of the disease. And what you're saying, Jonas, is that most countries didn't do that. Like most countries, in fact, if you look around the world, most countries more or less locked down together at exactly the same time, middle of March 2020. At least most of the West, and actually most of the world. And yet, in most of those countries, they were very, very different. Like some places were hit very hard, like New York City at the time, or Italy, northern Italy, and other places the disease hadn't really yet arrived. Australia, New Zealand. You hadn't really seen a lot of the disease, and so everyone's locking down at the same time, even though there are different places in where the pandemic is. So that means that the countries aren't choosing whether to lock down based on where they are in the pandemic. They're choosing lockdown for exogenous reasons, for having to, you called it random, like nothing to do with the where they are in the pandemic curve.
Exactly. And I think the reason for this is that the information spread asymmetric with the disease. So we got the same information as in Denmark as they had in Sweden. The information level was more or less the same. That we have some cases in Denmark and in Sweden, and we know that it's very bad in Italy and also becoming bad in Spain. And then we choose two different decisions. But it turns out later that the situation in Sweden was actually much more severe at the date of lockdown than it was in Denmark. So we basically, Denmark got lucky. Norway was also lucky. Finland was lucky. Sweden was unlucky because the disease has spread much more before people was aware of the disease.
I mean, I saw this an assertion. I don't know if it's true, but I think there's some truth in it. That a lot of the Swedish population, especially in Stockholm, had been on vacation in northern Italy for skiing or something, and they come home and brought the disease with them. Whereas like southern Sweden and Denmark had not yet had their vacations.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe that's why.
No, actually they had the vacation earlier. So in Denmark, it's...
they had that vacation earlier before the disease is spread to Italy. Yeah, that's what it was.
So in Denmark, it's in week 7 and 8, and Sweden, it's week... they spread 7, 8, 9, 10, and Stockholm is week 9. And that was when there was a large outbreak in the Alps that was unknown. So they didn't know there was an outbreak. So they got infected and went home to Sweden and went to work.
Okay, so how many papers do you start with in this meta-analysis? When you said there's a funnel where you're like getting all the whole papers, how many roughly? Just with
19. I think it was almost 19,000 papers. So what we did was we wrote a computer code that went through Google Scholar and different SSRN and some different preprint servers, and then we just
SSRN. So folks may not know what SSRN is. That's the Social Science Research Network, where economists and others social scientists post their papers even before they're published.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of this was preprint, so it was not what's called peer-reviewed literature. But then we just gathered all these studies, and then first we just simply look at the title, because we're interested in the effect of lockdown on mortality. And if the title was the effect of lockdown on pollution in Shanghai or something like that, then we didn't even read the study. We just said, okay, this is not of interest to us. And after that, I think we had about 1,100 studies left, and all those studies.
Okay, just so people realize, that's a lot of studies looking at the effect of lockdown on mortality. So 1,100 studies by through the pandemic. I mean, obviously there's a tremendous scientific interest in it. All right, so 1,100 studies out of the 19,000 seem like they're on point.
Yeah, and then all the studies that we thought that we couldn't say from the title that that this has nothing to do with mortality. We opened all of those studies and read the abstract and said, to just be sure, does this have anything to do with mortality? I'll see if I can find the figure here. Figure 1 for 2 seconds, so I don't say anything wrong here. But then we went here.
Well, we can put the figure up for listeners and readers, viewers to see. But just roughly, so you had
so we have 1,200 studies that were possibly
1,200 studies. So that's a lot of studies to read. But then how do you determine whether they are modeling studies, whether the counterfactual is determined by modeling, or that they're interrupted time series, or something that's like much more reasonable? It gives you a reasonable chance to actually identify what the effect of the lockdowns actually were in reality.
And then we went through all these 1,200 studies, and then we just answered 2 questions: whether it was measuring the effect of lockdown on mortality, and whether it used an empirical approach. And then it was just yes, no to this questions for all of these 1,200 studies.
So, Jonas, you read 1,200 studies, is what you're saying? With an
I wouldn't say I read it. I looked at them, but it's to be honest, it's fairly easy to see it's fairly easy to see if you can answer no, because if they write that we studied it, I mean, the title may not say that it's about pollution, but if the abstracts say we measure the effect on pollution, then okay, this is not an interesting study. And then after we did this, we got down to 146 studies, and then we read through all these studies to see if it was one of the, if it used this difference approach, and also it was looking at mortality, the mortality effect of lockdowns. So basically, I read thoroughly these 146 studies.
Okay, so the point is that you from this vast galaxy of studies that are focused on lockdown effects, a subset of them look on lockdown effects on mortality, and in some in some period of time, in the early, assume in early 2020, and then a subset of those actually use reasonable methods that have a chance of actually measuring whether the lockdown worked or didn't work.
Yes.
And just one. I know the answer to this question, but I need to ask it. You weren't rejecting studies because of the answer at this point. You were just looking at the methodology,
Yes.
not
Yes.
the answer produced by the studies.
No, there's I mean, there are many studies that find a significant effect of lockdowns. But we included everything that used this that looked at mortality effects and used an empirical method to do it.
So you're not cherry picking studies based on the answer. Because I've seen that criticism in Twitter and elsewhere. You're not cherry picking studies on that. You literally, it's based on, are they using rigorous methods that have a reasonable chance of measuring the impact of the lockdown on mortality?
Yeah. We took everything that was within our that was eligible to, given our protocol. So there's no
right.
We took everything there is, and I wouldn't call it cherry picking to say that we don't include a study for looking at pollution in Shanghai or something like that. So we took everything.
No, that's certainly not cherry picking, right? That's outside the scope. Like you're
exactly
right. I mean, I thought that was quite an unfair criticism, but I wanted to give you a chance to respond. Okay. How many studies you have after all of this?
Yeah, then in the end, we had 32 studies that used this difference in difference method, and you looked at mortality rates, and then we standardized the estimates. So that's an important part of the meta study, I think. So because there's a big difference between a significant result and a statistical significant result and a political significant result, and you can't really know if a result is a political significant if you don't know the effect sizes. So there's one study that say that.
So when you say political significance, you mean like, should it change policy? Like, is this something that's like, so for instance, like just to take the example of a drug in a randomized trial, let's say you give a drug in the control group, in the treatment group, it prevents one death in a million, and may have some side effects, but you have such a large sample size, let's say millions and millions of people, it's statistically significant, right? So there's a difference that you can measure very accurately, but that difference is actually so small that you wouldn't actually change how whether doctors should recommend the drug to patients or not. Right?
Exactly.
So the difference between should it change decisions in the real world versus is it accurately measured in the study? Those are two different questions. And the question of statistical significance is it measured accurately in the study versus does it matter at all? If the effect is so small and that you shouldn't consider it in the real world. That those are two distinct questions but they both have the word significance but attached to them.
Exactly, and there's actually one case we write about in our paper where we there's a paper that say that lockdowns plays as an important role in fighting the pandemic. But when we look at the actual results, I mean, they are significant, but it's only 2 to 3% fewer deaths. So I mean, it's not to neglect that. Of course, it's nice to be saved, but it's not. I mean, it's just so far from the estimates from Imperial College that it's not worth talking about. So that's basically the difference between these, and also to be able to kind of sum up the whole evidence, you have to need some standardized measure. You can't just say that. I mean, it's difficult to summarize it if it's all kind of different variables that they use. So some is in percentage, and some is measured as avoided death per 100,000. And basically what we did, we used a fairly simple method to to standardize it to a percentage. So basically, what we did was that some studies just say that it reduced mortality by 10%. So that's fairly easy. Other studies say that it reduces mortality by 1 per million. So what we did in those cases was that we looked at, okay, how many people actually died, had died from COVID at the end of the study period. And then we took this 1 per million and compared that to how many actually died, and then calculated the percentage base of that. So even though the two studies were different, had a different measure, we could compare them afterwards after our standardization. So it's a fairly simple conversion, but I think we actually chose to make it simple and easy to understand instead of some kind of black box calculation, just to make sure that everybody could, just to make it transparent, so everybody could see what was going on.
So you have these 32 studies. Some of them are measured in percentage decrease in deaths from the lockdown, others measured in absolute numbers. But you basically normalize all of them, so you can compare the results of these 32 studies with one another regarding the key thing you care about is what impact does the lockdown have on mortality?
Yes, exactly. And then there was 10 studies where this approach was not possible because they measured something that could not be converted to a percentage. So we actually have in the end we have 22 studies where we have the standardized estimates.
How different were those 10 studies from the 22 other than the fact that you couldn't convert it? Did they tend to
they are comparable.
Find the lockdown?
They're comparable. We looked at if they found a positive, significant positive, insignificant or significant negative effect of lockdowns. And they were comparable to the rest of the studies. So they're not.
So comparable means
very different.
Qualitatively, they're saying the same thing that you found in the 22 studies that you did end up including.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what now? I've led you up to this path just with all these like detours, just so we can understand. But now the punchline: what did you find? Did lockdowns work to save life?
Well, the short answer is yes. Because we find an effect. We find that lockdowns, the average lockdown in Europe and the United States, reduced death by. So just before I say the numbers,
it's spring.
Yeah, we used two different methods. Yeah, it's in the spring of 2020. Yeah, but there's actually two groups of studies. The one group looks at the stringency index and say, if you have a more strict lockdown, does that work? And there's another group of studies that look at each specific non-pharmaceutical intervention. So they answer the question: Does masks works? Do banning gatherings works? And so on. And we do some calculations, so we get two comparable results, and those. But in essence, they are the same. Based on the studies,
let me ask you concretely, Jonas. So, how many lives did the American lockdown save in 2020, in March, April 2020? According to your study, roughly.
I think it's so many. 2 seconds. Yeah, let me say. I know you know the answer, but we have it here. Yeah, so it's. So based on the stringent studies, we estimate that lockdowns reduced mortality by 3.2%, which translate into approximately 4,000 avoided death in the United States. If you look on the other 4,000, yeah. If you look at the other group of studies, then the estimate is 10.7%, which translates into approximately 16,000.
Okay, so the result is that the lockdowns, if the United States had not locked down in March of 2020, there would have been somewhere between 4,000 and 16,000 more people dead at the end of those 2 months. The Imperial College model, the projection was 2 million more dead without a lockdown. Right, so that's interesting, right? That's a big difference. Now, but I want to explore the 4,000, 16,000. The study that you're looking at is just purely, does the lockdown protect you from dying from COVID? There's another side to this equation, right? Does the lockdown itself also cause harm not measured in the studies that you're analyzing? Right? So, for instance, does the lockdown delay people from getting a cancer screening, right? So you get delayed, like later stage cancer diagnosis. Do you stay at home because you're so scared with a heart attack and die at home of a heart attack? Do you not manage your diabetes correctly? Are there like high levels of depression and suicidality that later lead to drug abuse? None of that is measured in the things. You're only looking in a sense that at the benefit of the lockdowns. You're not measuring the harms of the lockdowns.
We only look at COVID mortality. Yeah.
Right, COVID mortality. So 4,000, 16,000. The lockdown worked. In a sense, it worked. Like it would have. In a sense, somewhere between 4,000, 16,000 people would have been alive at the end of those 2 months that were alive as a result of the lockdowns, that would have been dead from COVID. But you don't have the other side. You don't know how many other people would have died.
And just because if you listen to 416,000, it is a lot of lives that you save. But just to put it into perspective, there's approximately 38,000 flu deaths every year in the United States. So almost 40,000 flu deaths. So compared to a standard flu season, it's just a bad flu season basically. That you
Well, I saw maybe push back a little bit about that. The estimate you're getting is what's the marginal impact of the lockdowns on COVID deaths, not the total number of COVID deaths, right? So it's much worse than a flu season. A lot more people died than a flu season, but the action taken to lock down to prevent those deaths had a very small impact on the total number of lives saved, lives lost as
exactly. Yes.
Right.
I think that actually, now you said, I think that's one of the things that I regret we didn't really spell out in the first version of our working paper, that physical distancing absolutely works. I mean, if you are in your own house and not with anybody else, you probably won't get infected. But because I think a lot of people got angry with us because they thought that we said that physical distancing doesn't work. But maybe we can come back to that when we talk about the reaction to our study.
No, this is exactly where I was going to go in this conversation. Why did you get such a small number, right? Because theoretically, let's take the example of a rich gazillionaire in the United States who, like a man named Howard Hughes, in the 20th century, very famously, he was very germophobic. He isolated himself for years in order to avoid getting infectious diseases or exposed to infectious diseases. That works if you can do it, if you can afford it, right? Why didn't it work?
You mean why a lot of people died of COVID?
Yeah, why did a lot of people die from COVID during the lockdowns? Like, why did the measured effect of the lockdowns that you have is somewhere between 4,000 and 16,000? Why is that number so small? Why isn't it 2 million like the Imperial College model estimate had suggested might?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And we have. I mean, this is not the primary object of our study, but
a lot
into this anyway. I think there are basically two explanations, and the most important explanation is that I think, at least, is that people took care of themselves, basically. So, I mean, as we talked about earlier, people canceled restaurant visits, they canceled flights, they canceled parties. They stopped seeing the neighbors, stopped seeing their friends. They worked from home if they were able to. So we did all kind of voluntary behavior changes to fight the pandemic. And then the lockdowns just came on top of that. So most of the things that actually worked was based on voluntary behavior changes. And I think this is especially true because lockdowns only regulate a small share of the transmission, possible transmission contacts, because most transmissions they take place in the families, at the workplace, or in the health or care sector. And those sectors were usually they weren't affected by lockdowns. So most people still went to work because else, if we don't go to work, everybody dies because we need electricity, we need water, and so on, and sewage, and so on. So people still went to work, and people obviously people still have to be with their families, and people also still need healthcare and general care. So those situations where transmission is most likely weren't affected by lockdowns. What lockdowns did affect was people's ability to go shopping, but that's a low risk situation. So I don't have a percentage on this, but imagine that you have 100%. So you have 100 contacts, and then 90% of them take care in these settings where the state can't regulate. I mean, you can't control what happens in the workplace. At least it's very difficult to do through regulation, and almost impossible to enforce. And then if a fraction of that happens in these settings that you can actually lock down, so you can lock down skater parks or what else? So it's, I don't really see a situation where lockdowns will be effective, to be honest, because it's very, very difficult to regulate what's going on in the families and the workplaces. You have to depend on voluntary behavior changes. So you have to, what you can do as a government is to inform people on what you think they can do to protect themselves. So in the beginning it was hand washing. We now know that's probably helps, but there's more to it than that. But just basically give the population the information you have, so they can protect themselves as good as possible.
Just to look at your view. So the key thing, your story is that, and I think there's a lot to this, is that the lockdowns, what they did is they restricted activities where it wasn't particularly risky. The formal lockdowns, what they did, whereas the activities that people kind of had to do no matter what, whether you lock down or not, those lockdowns couldn't have had an effect, right? Going to work for to grow food or to or whatnot. In other words, the lockdown it failed because they didn't rely on the local knowledge of people about what really is riskiest in their life, what's really most important in their life. They imposed from essentially from a central planner that every activity that the central planner didn't want to happen wouldn't happen, even if those activities had very little effect on disease spread. That's the story.
Yeah, so you can say that either it was very low risk activities, or people didn't want to do them anyway. So, it didn't have an effect. So maybe you closed down concerts, but people didn't want to go to a concert because they knew that it was a high risk situation. So they stayed away anyway. So so basically you close down things that are low risk or people don't want to do anyway. I think that's what explains our results.
Let me give you an alternate, maybe an additional story, because I think that there's a lot to your story that I agree with, and it seems right. But I think another reason why lockdowns failed is that maybe not so much Denmark, but many places are quite unequal in the living circumstances of the people that live there, right? So if you look broadly across the world, there's very, very poor countries and very, very rich countries. The inequality, this kind of just fact of an inequality, means that the lockdowns are going to impact people very, very differently. Some people are going to be able to comply with the lockdowns more efficiently than other people. And so just again, going back again to for instance, that study in Mumbai in July of 2020 was 70% seroprevalence of the disease in the Mumbai slums, 20% in the richer parts of Mumbai. That's an example, I think, of that. The capacity to deal with lockdowns since it's so different, means that for large parts of the world population, they can't last for very long. If they work for a short time, that's it. That people can't comply, just simply cannot, because they don't have the economic means to do so. And that means the disease is going to spread whether you impose the lockdown or you don't.
Yeah, I think that's probably also an explanation. And actually, to remember this Bangladesh mask study, It was actually a really, really interesting study. Do you remember this? Where they randomized? They
I
actually
know this study.
randomized.
Yes.
So basically, what they did was they randomized the use of masks in a lot of villages in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And then the story at least in the Danish media was that here's the proof that masks work. But the point is, the point I want to make here is that that the mask was actually mandated both before, during, and after the study period. So it didn't say anything about the mask mandate, because there was always already a mask mandate in Bangladesh, but people just neglected it because it wasn't enforced. So I think that's kind of your story too, right? That, I mean, you can make all kind of rules from the government, but if people don't want to obey them, then it's very difficult to make them enforce it. To enforce
we can have a whole nother podcast on mask studies, and I think that there's actually there's a Danish mask study I thought was quite interesting, Jonas, that randomized masks in among Danes, actually. I think 2,000, 3,000 Danes, and half assigned to wear a mask, half assigned not to, for a month. And there was very little impact, actually. This is like, I think the study was conducted in late 2020. Very little impact.
It's called Denmas.
Difference in the probability. Yeah, the Denmas study. But it was so it's it's frustrating if you are a public health person and you want to do good here. You want, but the problem is the tools to manage a pandemic like this are not all that effective. Like just the fact that people have very different living circumstances from each other by itself, and the fact that you have to
I'm not
you have to, like,
sure.
I'm
not sure I agree on that, because we have many tools that can help people in this situation. First of all, information. I mean, information is very, very important, and that's I mean, at least as the world is today, I think the government is the most natural.
So Joe, let me try to modify my statement in response to you, because I think you're right. It's not that there's no tools. It's that the tools that seem most effective, like intuitively, are not necessarily the most effective, right? So the lockdown, the physical, like in Denmark, I'm sure they in the United States, we had this all over the place, like these physical plastic barriers between people in places. You think those kinds of tools, those physical things will work intuitively, but until you have good evidence that they do, you probably shouldn't be telling the public that they will work. And the lockdowns are an interesting thing here, because, like, it's, as you said, it was imposed all around the world all at once, almost all, without any regard to where they were in the pandemic curve, and actually without any prior experience of worldwide lockdowns to control this disease spread. It was essentially a massive experiment done all at once.
Yeah. And I'm not 100% sure. I mean, if there's a disease, and you know that there's some people have to go to work, and they have to sit in front of customers the whole day, and you don't have any proof of what's. I mean, you don't know what will work in that situation, but you have your intuition. Then, I mean, what do you do as a health professional? You say that, okay, if it was me, I would put up a plastic screen and maybe wear masks and try to ventilate.
I know,
so we have as much.
Like,
I think that the difference. Yeah, I know it's very complex, but you also, I mean,
like, so for instance, like the cloth masks, like they take the cloth masks that were recommended early in the pandemic. They did nothing. Like no randomized trials shown any evidence of any efficacy of protecting anyone from the use of a cloth mask, right? Yet they were recommended at scale. So imagine a vulnerable older person thinking to themselves, well, I heard on the radio that the cloth masks will protect me, and then they wear the cloth mask and they take risks in the middle of a huge outbreak that they otherwise would not take, because they think they're protected by the cloth mask. You may end up actually killing people with this.
Yeah, okay. I may agree on the mask, but that's because beforehand we knew that they didn't work. But I think where I draw the line is if you start mandating people. So I think that's a big difference. between a health professional saying, okay, if it was me, I would put up a plastic screen and then open the windows and then cross your fingers. That's a big difference from saying that and then going to say, okay, by this law, you have to open the windows and you have to have a plastic screen because we say so. And that's true, for me at least. It's two very different things because in a situation like that, if you don't know what to do, you probably just give your best advice. I know. Mostly as an economist, people sometimes ask me about financial questions, and I don't know much about finance. And to begin with, I just said that. I would. Basically, I gave him no answer. But as I grew older, I started saying, okay, if it was me, I would do this because I understood that I probably know. Even though I'm not a financial expert, I know a little more than they do. And they're asking for my help. So I just say, if it was me, I would do this. And I think it's fair for a health professional to say that during pandemic, that we have no evidence of what's working here. But if it was me, I would wash my hands. I would put up this plastic screen and what else? Because it's an advice.
I guess that's fair. Like people are looking at you for advice, and you may not know, but you probably have a better chance of knowing than anyone else because this is your experience and job, right? But then like the key thing there is absolute honesty about what you really do know with some confidence and versus things that you don't know with confidence, right? You don't.
Yeah, what you really want is two different. Sorry. Yeah. If you have two different what's called Anthony Fauci's basically, you have two different persons from the government. One say that I would do this and I would do this, but basically we don't know. And they could disagree on their recommendations.
It's very difficult. Anthony Fauci's, that's the
yeah. It's of course very difficult to handle in a government, but basically that would probably be the best situation.
So I take it you're not a big fan of censorship of different scientific points of view. Like you should allow people with different scientific points of view to speak.
I think that's a good idea too. No matter what the circumstances are.
Okay, on this, I think on a lot we agree. It's certainly on that we agree. I did bring this up on purpose because I wanted to talk about the reaction that you received in response to publishing the preprint version of your paper. And from the outside, it just looked. I felt so bad for you and for Lars and for Steve because it looked like you were subject to pretty vicious attacks, and in many ways quite unfair by people who didn't really read the paper or the methods or anything like that. They just didn't like your answer. Can you describe that reaction and sort of how you handled it?
Yeah, it's true that we had a lot of criticism. To begin with, there was some. No, so let's go a little back. To begin with, it was very difficult to get it into the media, at least in Denmark. I was in contact with several newspapers, but none of them wanted to write about it. But then I think it was Dr. McCarthy from Johns Hopkins University who mentioned that at Tucker Carlson's show, and then it's at least in the world press it took off from there. And then shortly after, the criticism started to appear, and I think the most annoying thing was that, most of it was not really a critique of our study. It was just phrases that was used to kind of make our study look bad. So, for instance, I was in the Danish public radio, and they had a scientist, a researcher that I know, who said that, and they brought a quote from him where he said that okay, so they use 8 studies for this 3.2 percentage result, and the best is to have 30 studies, and that's more or less what he said. And then that was used as a critique of our study. But we can't. What should we do? Should we invent? It doesn't make our study a bad study. It just say, given the evidence that we have right now, this is the best estimate we have. This is the best knowledge we have right now. we can't say that okay, we don't have 8. We've just immense 22 non-existing studies to get to the 30. So it's kind of, so it was used to criticize our study, but basically it's just, I mean, that's just, if you want to write about that, you should just write that there's only 8 studies, and it would of course be better to have more studies. That's clear. But for instance, the lockdowns was introduced based on basically 0 studies, and vaccines was introduced based on 3 studies, I think. So 8 studies is not, I mean, it's something. It's not totally bad.
Yeah, I mean, I
the
issue is, it's not just the number of studies, it's the scope of those studies, right? You're looking at essentially complete data, population level data, analyzed by people who are very, very, I mean, in the final, after the funnel has reached the 32 studies or whatever, analyzed by very, very capable people who have a lot of experience pulling out the signal of a causal signal from a complicated situation where you can't do randomization, right? So it's not the number of studies. I mean, you're looking at, it's the quality of the studies that matters, and the fact that those studies are essentially a population scale that matters here, right? It struck me as a very odd criticism. Like, where did that rule come from? 30 or whatever. It made no sense.
I mean, I don't think he means 30 that specifically 30, but it clearly it's just better with more studies, and he has been very helpful during our work. Then I think that sentence was taken out of context, and that was the only quote they had from the whole conversation with him, and they just used that, and there was several of these small attacks that was kind of used to undermine the quality of the study, but basically it was just, I mean, it didn't have any impact on the result, and it was not really a criticism.
As best I could tell from reading the criticisms, and I read a lot of them, most of the people had not read your study at all.
No,
I think methods had not sought to understand what you were about, and I think most of them had sort of, in a way, they'd formed their opinion about the lockdowns from other sources, maybe from the modeling studies or just their intuition or something. And it was essentially, they didn't like the answer because it contradicted their intuition or their preconceived notion about lockdown, rather than asking, the honest question of, like, what do the data actually say?
Yeah, and I think that's
if
it's just going.
I mean, if you had reached a different, I mean, I took a very strong position against the lockdowns. I still think the harms of the lockdowns are the primary reason not to do them. Like, they're tremendously impactful on the lives of especially poor people and children and whatnot. But on the questions of how effective the lockdowns were, I suspected they didn't work very well, but I didn't know that. That was my prior, and I was looking for a study like yours to test that. If you had found a different answer, I would have changed my mind, Jonas. If the very best studies that employed those methodologies had found a different answer, I would have changed my mind. I mean, that's how scientists are normally supposed to be. I mean, in fact, I just say, you said earlier in this podcast that the lockdown saved lives. I bristled at that a little bit because I don't want it to be true, the lockdown saved, but it is what it is. You found what you found. Like, I'm not supposed to, like, I can't like theorize over the basic facts that you found. It was frustrating to see some of those studies that used faulty counterfactuals, modeling counterfactuals, taken as if they were good studies. And what was really the strong point of your study was that you focused your attention on the very best studies, the ones that had the best chance of actually honestly measuring the impact of the lockdowns. And you found that they worked a little bit.
Yeah. I think, I mean, the part I was most, I mean, all of our methodology, I was pretty sure that that it was, I mean, we had been very thorough, and because I've been through another study that also received a lot of flack. So I was kind of prepared for this, and we had for this study we had a protocol, but it's not that common in social sciences, and I've thought a lot about how to do this properly. But the only thing where I was not sure that our method was, I mean, it was an okay method, but maybe there was a better method, was this standardization of the estimates that we talked about earlier. and that was actually the point where I was most nervous to get to receive critique, because maybe there's an even better method than that. But there was nobody who mentioned that. And also, in our updated version, we also found out that we actually included 1 or 2 studies that were not difference in difference studies. They were actually these interrupted time series studies, but they found very large effects. One of them found that school closures reduced mortality rates by 50%. So it was a fairly large effect. But it was just not a difference in difference study. It was very difficult to read, so we included it because I didn't want to exclude it if it was a difference in difference study. But then later we found out that in one of the appendixes that it actually was an interrupted time series studies. But nobody pointed at that study and said that study that found a very large effect should not be included. So I think the critique was very biased. But it was also, I mean, to be honest, our updated version and this final paper that that is forthcoming in Public Choice has improved significantly because of the critique. Not because we changed much in our method, and the results are basically the same, but we did a lot more explanation of why these results are small, why they're not likely to be caused by this confusion of causality and correlation, why it was okay to exclude this synthetic control method studies, and so on. So a lot of the decisions we made have been much more, they're much better founded now than they were with the first version.
So let's talk a little bit about, because you just made some news. You said that the study is now about to be published in a peer-reviewed journal called Public Choice. It's a fantastic journal, and congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
But the journey to get to there, I understand, was quite frustrating. So, for instance, I wrote a piece with your co-author for the study, Steve Hanke, in the essentially reporting the fact that when you sent your study, the preprint version of it, to SSRN, this preprint network where a lot of social scientists publish their work so that they can get comments from and feedback from other people, the SSRN told you that you are not allowed to publish your study there.
Yeah, we
that's remarkable. I mean, because you have a rigorous study, it finds an answer on a really important question. Whether it's right or wrong, I mean, that's the whole purpose of SSRN, is to allow you to show the study to other scholars, and they can give you feedback. Yet SSRN said, no, you're not allowed to publish study. Why did they do that? What reason did they give you?
Yeah, the reason was basically that it was about COVID, and they had to be more careful about COVID research. But we could see that there was plenty of studies published after we tried to publish our study at the network. And also, we were allowed
In fact, there was a critique. There was a critique of your study that SSRN published, but they didn't publish your study.
We also published our protocol at SSRN. So we published the protocol, and then somebody published a critique of our study. And then when we tried to upload our study, it was rejected for some reason. And I think the SSRN, I don't totally remember the rules for allowing work to be on the preprints server, but it's very basic. I mean, it has to be in English and stuff like that. So very basic. So basically, it just says you can publish everything here. Be our guest. But for some reason, during the COVID pandemic, they introduced this more subjective evaluation of what kind of work could be uploaded there. And to be honest, I'm not a big fan of that. I mean, either you publish everything, or you have this peer review process.
It's frankly outrageous. I mean, by the way, the same very, very similar thing happened to me with a study asking whether COVID early lockdowns had an impact on disease spread. The medRxiv refused to let us publish this as a preprint server. We're basically, I mean, you can look, there's millions of studies, much lower quality than ours, that were published as a preprint, and they rejected our study, which was then published later that month in an excellent medical journal. So it's one of these things where like the preprint servers wanted to put the thumb on the scale about public perception about the scientific evidence coming out about lockdown effectiveness. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. Like, and in a way, the editors of preprint servers, they thought to themselves that if you allow these studies that find the kinds of results you found, then the public will not comply with the lockdown orders. They'll question public health orders. But shouldn't that what science do? Like if the public health orders, the scientific evidence, like what you found, find that has a very small effect, isn't it important for those preprint servers to print them so that like an actual discussion can happen around actual data as opposed to theorizing or presumption or political discussion?
Yeah, you would say that. I mean, to be honest, I think my understanding of a preprint server is that it doesn't care if it's important or not important or what it is. It just allows researchers to publish their work so they can discuss it with other researchers. And then during this process where they discuss back and forth and upload new versions and finally send it to a journal to get it peer reviewed, that's where the funneling is taking place, where you figure out if it's a good study, if it's an important study, and so on. And then if it's very important and very good, you end in a good journal. If it's not important and very bad, you end in a trash journal. And that's how science work. But I don't think that's the role of the preprint servers. They just publish everything, right? Based on these simple rules that have to be linear and so on. But objective rules.
I mean, that's the normal. I mean, the goal is to like promote conversations and information exchange among scientists as they're having ideas, as they're developing ideas, and so then they can get the formal evaluation happens when you send it to a journal, right? But I think
I think you saw this. I mean, this was also part of the critique we got, that you could see these different standards, I think you can call it. For instance, this Flaxman study, when it came out, it was just published in all the newspapers. They lockdowns to save 3.2 millions. Hooray! No critical answers asked. Even though they wrote that they couldn't distinguish between voluntary behavioral changes and the effect of lockdowns, nobody asked any questions about it. Then we published our study, and the media are just, I mean, down to very, very small, like these numbers of studies, or if there's one study in the group of studies that we have where the researchers have made a mistake that we correct, and what's going on here. So they're just very nitty-gritty on our study for some reason, and try to find errors that are basically not there. And for instance, was this when our study came out, there was the Science Media Center. It's basically it is what it says. So it takes up known studies and then kind of gets some reaction from some experts. They get some reactions to the study, so they kind of explain what it is. And the Science Media Center, they asked four people to evaluate our work, and 3 of them was from Imperial College London, at least affiliated with Imperial College London, and criticized these people in our study, saying that they used this modeling to it was Flaxman and Ferguson and what was the name of Samir Bath or something, the last person. And I mean, first of all, they're not peers because they're not economists. They're not social sciences. They were they were epidemiologists and so on. So they're not what's called academic peers to us. So basically, they were evaluating something that was not in their field. And they were also, I mean, they were not unbiased. I mean, they had an interest in criticizing our study because we were criticizing their work. So they were not.
Well, I mean, let me. I mean, that's frustrating to hear, but let me just say, you were not criticizing their work. What you were doing was applying rigorous methods to try to identify the causal effect of the lockdowns. Their work was a modeling study. They cannot use that method to answer the question of what the effect of the lockdowns are, what the causal effect of the lockdowns were. I mean, their work may have some use, I don't know what, but it's not to answer the question, did the lockdowns work to save life or not? That's what your study was about, right?
Yeah, but basically they said,
in a way that like
basically they said that lockdowns are going to save millions, and we said no, actually they're just saving a few thousands.
Well, I mean, the thing is that is a misuse of their study, right? Their study cannot say, because the methods will not enable them to say the lockdown will save millions. What they can say is that in our modeling exercise, the lockdown saved millions. Well, and the question is that how applicable is that modeling exercise to the real world? Those are all very, very important, different questions. They should have been much more careful in their public discussion about the limitations of their model.
Yes, they should. And they should have mentioned that they couldn't distinguish. They should have mentioned that they couldn't distinguish voluntary behavior changes from the effect of lockdowns, and they didn't. Actually, they neglected the voluntary behavior changes and said that this is lockdowns that saved all these lives. So, but at least they had an interest in it. And then there was one economist who was actually quite positive to our study. And the interesting thing is that when this report from the Science Media Center came out, then fact checkers around the world started referring to this report, this article, and all of them just referred to the three people from Imperial College London, and nobody referred to this economist, our peer, who was positive to our work. So yeah, it was a very strange period of my life. But to be honest, I was more frustrated than I was sad, because I mean that there wasn't one critique that came out where I thought that, oops, this is not good. All of it was just like, okay, they don't understand what's going on.
Jonas, I mean, I went through a couple of periods like this, more than 2 periods during the pandemic. And I'll tell you, what I've concluded is that science had nothing to do with the attack that you had, the critiques that you had, and those fact checkers, they were not coming from a scientific critique. They had already made up their minds, and they were seeking confirmation of their pre-given conclusions, and it was to serve a particular political purpose, right? The lockdowns had been essentially, if the lockdowns really only saved in the United States 4,000, 1,600 lives early on, or whatever, 16,000 lives early on, then given the harms that they did, the school closures leading to massive learning loss, the trillions of dollars of expenditures, the inflation, the delayed cancer treatments, and the delayed the people that died of heart attacks, depression, suicides, and drug overdose, a whole host of other things that many of which continue to this day. Well, those lockdowns were not worth it, and that means the political leaders that impose them, that the scientists who signed on to them, well, their reputations are going to get hurt. Your study is just inconvenient rather than not untrue. And those fact checkers, they're serving the interest of the people whose decisions were self-evidently not all that beneficial, which is what your study concludes.
Yeah, I don't know why they behaved like this, but I think also it was just, I mean, who are these fact checkers? I mean, are they researchers? Do they know a lot about how you do meta-analysis in the social sciences?
They know nothing. They know nothing. They're not even. They wouldn't be fit to be peer reviews.
No, I think I read an interesting piece by Vinay Prasad. I think his name is pronounced. You probably know him. And where he talked about these fact checkers. And usually they took up. I mean, before the pandemic, they took up some very simple questions, basically. So is this aspartame from Diet Coke? Does it cause cancer? And it's a much more simple question than does lockdown reduce mortality? And I think it's just, I mean, I think basically they just didn't understand it, and then they kept to they like most people do. They say, okay, we know what lockdowns work. Now there's the study from a small group of researchers, and Tucker Carlson took it up. It's probably a bad study. So yeah, let's just listen to what this guy from a field far away from economics and social sciences, what he's saying, and then use that to criticize the study, because obviously it can't be true. So I think I don't think they kind of had an agenda, if you know what I mean. I think it was just a natural human response to this, based on a lot of confusions during the beginning of the pandemic, because we all saw that the pandemic was growing. Then we introduced lockdown, and then we confused causality and correlation and thought that lockdowns worked, which just wasn't the case.
I could understand that point of view for if you're talking about March, April, May, June 2020. But your paper, you wrote it in 2022, like 2 years had passed, and then for a while, the reaction then should have been much more measured and considered. But it wasn't.
Should have.
Right? There was. The problem is, like, people who had censored any kind of contrary opinion to the pandemic policies that were followed by much of public health, by many countries, including the lockdowns. Once you've done that kind of censoring on the basis that those opinions are so wrong that they must not be heard by the public, it's very difficult to allow there to be an honest evaluation of them that found that they were wrong. Like the stakes had been raised so that you couldn't allow that honest evaluation of the sort that you all did, right? It's not possible. Normally in policy debates, I mean, leave politics aside, but in policy debates, the stakes are not so high. If someone people get things wrong all the time. That's normal. Your career isn't destroyed. But the lockdown policy was so consequential that the response to it, the policy of, like, suppressing the speech of others who disagreed about them was so such a violation of the norms of these kinds of discussions that it made it almost impossible to accept your result as true, even though it is.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. I just don't think that the single journalist was kind of. I don't think she did it just to protect the government. I think she did it because she thought it was the right thing to do.
Fine, but why does her word stand over an actual analysis, or people who understand empirical methods, or why does her word get to define what how your results should be seen by the whole world? I mean, it's too much power in the hands of somebody who doesn't have the capacity to understand the arguments.
I think I agree. I think the work that the fact checkers did was just basically very bad work. They should have stayed to the more simple questions rather than going
or not have fact checkers subject at all, because they don't. I mean, they're not. They were a menace during the pandemic, in my view. Like, they actually harmed policy.
I agree.
Okay, we're going to close on that note, Jonas, because I promised you only an hour and a half, and we've come up on that time. But thank you for joining me. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, and it was really great to be able to talk about the science of your paper. Those listeners, we'll put in the show notes the links to the paper so you can read it yourself and decide for yourself. And until next time, this is Professor Jay Bhattacharya from Science from the Bridge talking to Jonas Herby. Jonas, I hope you come back and talk with us in the future.
It would be a pleasure. Thanks to me.